What's going to motivate them is anger and the seeking of vengeance. We weren't surprised when it finally happened. Now, what was the purpose of these sanctions? What did Madeleine Albright mean by it when she says the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children are worth it? What does she mean by that? Well, that raises the issue of regime change, which is the core essence of U.S. foreign policy. How do you get people that are pro-U.S. government into positions of power around the world in foreign countries? It's the same way they do domestically. You know how they try to get their people in public office and the governorships and the state legislatures and so forth? That's what they're doing overseas. That's the essence of foreign policy. Intervening in the foreign affairs of other countries, politicking over there, foreign aid, buying people off, coups, assassination, murders, invasions, sanctions, embargoes, in order to guarantee a ruler who will be a member of the coalition of the willing when he's needed, when he needs a vote in the United Nations, and so forth. That's what those deaths of 500,000 children were all about. The attempt to get rid of Saddam Hussein in order to install somebody who would do the bidding of the U.S. government. Iran, 1953. In that year, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh was elected to power, democratically elected. He was a prime minister, been elected by the parliament of Iran. Here was the foundation of democracy in Iran. This was a man who was highly respected by the Iranian people, beloved by them. Time magazine's Man of the Year, 1953. He commits the crime of nationalizing Iranian oil. Okay, as a libertarian, I could never support such a thing, but I also would never support foreign intervention to fix the problem. The way that I figure it is you go overseas as an oil company or a big business or a tourist, you take your risks. And if you don't want to take those risks, then don't travel overseas. But don't look to your federal daddy to come and bail you out when things go wrong. And that's what the British oil companies, who had lost their concessions in this nationalization, did. They ran to the CIA. The CIA secretly and surreptitiously enters Iran, instigates a coup that ousts Mossadegh from power, and reinstalls the brutal dictatorship of the Shah of Iran. The Shah proceeds to inflict a reign of terror on his own people to maintain control on power that involves torture chambers, terror, fully supported by the CIA. They didn't care what he did to his own people as long as they had their man doing their bidding and furnishing them the oil. The irony of this is that after that regime change, 1979, 25 years later, the Iranian people revolt against its brutal dictatorship. And they take U.S. diplomats hostage in the embassies. And you know what the reaction of U.S. officials was? Same thing it was after 9/11. We're innocent. We're innocent. We're a good government. We're a caring government. We're a compassionate government. We give food to people around the world. Woe is us. They just hate us for our freedom and values, these Iranian terrorists. The average American bought it. Because again, his predisposition is foreign policy, like the economy, is too complicated. I got to leave it to my experts in Washington. But the Iranian people, they knew the source of their anger, because by this time they had figured out what the CIA had done to their democratic system and how the CIA had destroyed it. And the blowback of it all was, as a result of that revolution, they didn't establish the democratic system that the CIA had overthrown. They established this extremist Islamic theocracy. 1 year later, 1954, Guatemala. The CIA, feeling the success, because this was a success for them. Man, this is real power, ousting people from office, putting your man in. They go into Guatemala and they do the same thing. They oust the democratically elected president of Guatemala, a man named Jacobo Arbenz. Now, Arbenz was a socialist, which meant that he really reflected the philosophy of Franklin Roosevelt. So what he was doing, what Arbenz's crime was, he was taking land that belonged to a U.S. corporation named United Fruit, land that wasn't being farmed, and he was giving it to the poor people. Again, as a libertarian, I'd never support such a thing. But how is that different from the socialist philosophy of Republicans and Democrats? I mean, is that not what the income tax is all about? Is that not what the estate tax is all about? Taking from the rich and giving to the poor? This is what Arbenz was doing. That wasn't his crime. His crime was he was jacking with a U.S. corporation that had contributed money, surprise, surprise, to members of Congress. They use their influence to get the CIA into Guatemala. They instigate a coup, again secretly, that ousts Arbenz from power, democratically elected, and they install a brutal military general. Now, there's something about Washington officials there's something that they love about generals. I mean, that's why they're supporting, for example, Pervez Musharraf in Pakistan. I mean, while they're killing people in Iraq for the sake of democracy, they tell us, at the very same time, they're supporting this unelected, brutal military general in Pakistan who's not only suspending members of the Supreme Court, he's putting them in jail. He's jailing lawyers, and U.S. officials are supporting him. They were doing the same thing in Latin America. They installed a general in Guatemala. They've supported these brutal regimes that are headed by generals. Why? Because they have this concept that generals establish order and stability. You know, that's why they were supporting Pinochet. You know, order and stability, because democracy's messy. It's unpredictable. You might come up with a Roosevelt or a Arbenz in power. Well, in Guatemala, they instigate what is essentially a 3-decade-long civil war. They ends up killing about 1 million Guatemalans, and in this entire process, they're supporting these generals, these brutal succession of regimes in Guatemala that are torturing people, killing people, a reign of terror, the likes of which they're training the troops at the School of the Americas and other U.S. installations. They've got torture manuals at the School of the Americas. These troops are returning to Guatemala where they're raping people and torturing people, and 3 decades of this. By their fruits you will know them. This is the essence of U.S. foreign policy. That's what the attacks on Castro were all about. As soon as Castro took power, it was clear that he was not going to do the bidding of U.S. officials. And U.S. officials who have this obsessive need to control Cuba that stretches back to the Spanish-American War in 1898, immediately engaged in regime change operations. You know, assassination attempts, coups, Bay of Pigs, and so forth. This is what the sanctions were about in Iraq. Now, they sprinkle little messages of, oh, well, this is about Saddam not disarming. Oh, if only he'll disarm. But no matter what Saddam did, he let in all the inspectors. He kept telling them, I've destroyed these weapons of mass destruction. It didn't matter. U.S. officials sent out the message. Once you get rid of Saddam, whether it's a coup or however way you do it, we'll lift the sanctions. How did they know? Why were they so convinced that they would find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? They had the receipts. They had the receipts. This is what Americans don't want to face. That when there was that partnership between Saddam Hussein and U.S. officials in the 1980s, it was the United States and other Western countries that were furnishing those biological weapons, those chemical weapons. They figured that he would still have some left over. And why had they furnished him these weapons? Because these experts in Washington wanted to help him kill Iranians in the Iraq-Iran war. And they wanted to help him kill Iranians because Iranians were now our enemies because they had had the audacity to revolt and oust our dictator. And when we had our dictator, they were our friends. And this is the essence of U.S. foreign policy. And this is what Americans don't want to face. And this is why they didn't want you to have that critical examination of U.S. foreign policy after 9/11. And that, of course, raises the issue of patriotism.